Let me see if I can switch over to stop mirroring so that I can drag this off to the appropriate side and get it displayed. You know, the nice part about a tech conference, and I speak at an embarrassing number of events, is that at a tech conference, when the IT bit doesn't work, people are like, yeah, fair. At an open source, not an open source, at like a NGO conference, I spend some time working in the NGO space. At a conference there, people are like, why is everything not working? So thank you so much for understanding the reality of technology fundamentally sucking, but paying my mortgage at the same time. So this talk is called Real Time and Other Stories That We Tell Ourselves. I think every talk should start with a brief, who am I? This is a list of companies that over the last 28 years have had the pleasure and patience to say that I'm part of them. Presently now, I work at ClickHouse. I started a database consulting firm at 17 years old because the high school that I was going to had a failed admissions database, and no one had ever told me that I couldn't figure out how to use SQL anywhere. So I just assumed that I could. And my father said, if you're going to do that, start a consulting firm. That was 28 years ago. I began my career as an engineer, and I learned over time that what I'm actually maybe best at is telling the story of the software that other people build. So I have the enviable position at ClickHouse of talking for a living. Some other things about me. I am a futurist. By that I mean I have 2 kids, and I have to be a futurist and believe that the future will be amazing for them. That's Gabriella Hannan, 17 years old, who looks like the coolest goth kid ever. She must take after mom, not her homeless-looking father. And Aoife, who's just now 13. As a family, we live in the Netherlands, which will become important in a moment. And this is my first time back in Australia in 23 years. 23 years ago, my wife and I were married, and we didn't know who not to invite. We were living in Colorado, and so we're like, we will invite everyone. We sent out almost 5,000 invites and told everyone we were getting married in Cronulla, south of Sydney. And like 70 folks showed up, so that was great. And there was side story. It's the end of the day. I can side story. There was this fish restaurant, like right by the water, this sort of idyllic fish restaurant, right? There's a boat outside where they've brought in the fish that they have caught that day. And they're closed on Sundays. And my dad walked in and he said, hey, if I bring 70 people, would you open on Sunday? And the guy was like, yeah. And so we had like the best fish ever. Ultimately, I like to view myself as a storyteller. So how many of you are familiar with ClickHouse? Awesome. And how many of you use it in some measure of anger right now? Or hopefully delight, not anger. Also awesome. That's kind of what I expected. This is not a product pitch, although the next 3 minutes are going to feel like one. I promise it's not. The reason that I'm sharing this is because in order to understand what I'm about to say, it's important that you understand the perspective that I am saying it from. This is context. So what is ClickHouse? ClickHouse is an open source, distributed, column-oriented database. Those are other words that describe what those things mean. Fundamentally, ClickHouse speaks SQL. It's great for lots of writes. It's distributed. It's highly efficient. It's very fast for queries, supports joins and lookups. Usually, like we're all familiar with select star from table, that's awesome in Postgres. And in ClickHouse, you're thinking more of things like select the average of something from a table where it's in the year of. So think about it more for aggregation, etc. It also supports views, materialized views, so views that change over time, projections, the same set of data, but ordered differently to make your queries very fast. That's the context that I have in my brain as I begin to share this with you. What is this talk? It's a fantastic question. To be honest, it's something I've labored quite a bit over. I have now flown 25 hours since Saturday. I've also been delayed by 16 hours. I also spent 5 days without luggage. It was the quintessential Qantas experience, really. I have learned that, so yeah, again, side note, but I'm going to anyway. It was Sunday in Singapore. And we were told that there was an operational delay and there were no pilots available. And so they needed to bring pilots from Sydney, but when they brought pilots from Sydney, they were past the number of allowed flight hours, so 16-hour delay. I got on the plane the next day, and I said to the purser, like, wow, that's a major operational issue. And she's like, yeah, I reckon they got drunk and went to the F1. And I was like, also a quintessential Qantas experience. So the agenda today, it was packed. There was an amazing amount of content. But not just an amazing amount of content, an amazing amount of content from like folk that I respect immensely. And so I spent this time wearing the same clothing I had for 5 days, without my luggage, severely jet lagged, thinking, what can I add? This was my abstract. It doesn't matter. This is what matters, the keynote. What is the etymology of the word keynote? A keynote in public speaking is a talk that establishes a main underlying theme. And I spoke first in Sydney, so I felt like this is my opportunity to set the stage for the day of people who are deeply passionate about data, people who are deeply passionate about the future. The term actually comes from a cappella singing, or as a musician. I played Latin jazz for a number of years, and the way that people who speak different languages communicate key centers is very different, so you find a common tone. And that sets the baseline for what you're about to perform. And so I asked myself, by the way, in Sydney I said it was the key of B flat because I was flat. I said to myself, that's great, but what is the closing talk of a session called? In Asia, it's often called a lock note. In America, it's often called a closing keynote. And I thought both of those terms are relatively shit. I want a different one. And so I'm calling this talk a capstone. The capstone, traditionally in architecture, was the last bit that was set into an arch. And before we had sort of the ability to tie stone together with concrete, it was the piece that held it together. It was often highly decorated. It was considered the most important part of the building. It protected the stones that were around it. So to take that extraordinarily lengthy, filled with words, abstract, I want to summarize my capstone as really, I want to talk about the cloud data warehouse, real-time, architecture, and decision-making. Let's spend a minute, again, as context, just unbundling the concept of the cloud data warehouse. The landscape's evolved. As I said, I began my career a very long time ago. My first sort of proper job in data engineering, data warehouse design was for IBM, working with DB2 and flying around and teaching people data warehousing fundamentals course where we talked about the difference between facts and dimensions and how you could implement them in DB2 on AIX. I lived in that far right side of the slide. 30 years ago, we really relied on these on-prem infrastructures, IBM, Hadoop, Oracle, Teradata, to manage our data. And the volumes that we were managing, like I remember when I first hit 100 gigabyte in a system and I was like, the world is ending. There's so much data. What is going to happen in the future? The volumes we were managing were much smaller. And then about a decade ago, we experienced the beginning of the shift to cloud. And that's changed over time, and it's been different via region. And the traditional cloud data warehouses that we know, that we love, Snowflake, Redshift, BigQuery, emerged and began to allow folk like us to build things that we were never able to build before. We had more data, but we ran into some challenges around performance, around concurrency, and to overcome these at scale, particularly for the notion of real-time analytics, can be a bit costly. The landscape is evolving, has evolved again. I think Lee touched on this quite a bit earlier today. It was really compelling that you can couple real-time systems, be that streaming, as Adia showed us, be that real-time analytics with ClickHouse, with incredibly compelling and powerful offline and batch systems, and drive a user experience that is unique. That paradigm of architecture is both simpler and more cost-effective, while also giving us the opportunity to scale. I'll talk about that in just a second, because every tech talk needs an architecture diagram. But let's look at what that architecture sort of looks like a bit. If you look at this, you've probably built this, or you work in an organization that has built this. This is, and also this was, state of the art. But if you notice here, a number of these consumers of data are actually only powered by a subset of the services. And the fundamental shift that we have seen is people are taking the data that lived in the world of batch and said, I want to actually build user experience on top of that. Lee's example was of cycling, right? I'm going to give the consumer more access to data. And so in yellow here are some of the workloads that map towards that model. And of course, I'm biased. I wear it on my chest. ClickHouse is a good fit for that, but also squirrel. Chasing things that are interesting is what really I find most compelling, and I think the reason that most of you are here. If you wanted to talk about data warehouses in detail, there's booths outside. You could do that anytime. If you want to think about how do we build differently, you come to a show like Data Eng Bytes. So I come back to the question, what is this talk? This talk is the reason that you're not drinking beer right now. But what is this talk? I once gave a talk called Learning Databases and Learning Languages, where I tried to sort of relate my process over the last 8 years of learning Dutch with learning new technology, right? And I still speak Dutch as if I was a 5-year-old. Basically like, I love cheese. Do you have beer? And those, I mean, to be fair, that gets you by through most of the Netherlands. We speak the same as we learn new technology. My encouragement is to feel free to sound stupid, because those questions provide the basis by which you can learn idioms. In Dutch, met de deur in huis vallen means I've kicked in the door of your house, which is basically a way of saying I'm going to say something wildly inappropriate and uncomfortable right now. Or nu komt de aap uit de mouw means now the monkey is coming out of the sleeve, which is a way of saying, I see what you're saying, there's the truth. There are idioms in languages, there are idioms in the tooling that we choose. And that's what Zach has done, I think, uniquely effectively in comparison to others in the boot camp, is you learn idioms and you become conversational rather than having an academic understanding of tooling. So I reframe this talk as the stories that we tell ourselves. Or perhaps a capstone should challenge you to think deeply, if only for the purpose of triggering your neurons for the future. Or perhaps, since I got out and had a walk, architecture is really compelling. So let's discuss architecture for a minute, but not this architecture. This is the "what the hell have you built" slide that became incredibly famous during the era of NoSQL. Sadly, the company that I was working for at the time is on the "what the hell have you built" slide. Not this architecture, this architecture. A very famous building in Finland, which, by the way, if you don't know, curved metal structures also have capstones, just functioned as rivets at the point of triangular intersection. This kind of architecture. This is a very famous painting, and it's one that I find incredibly compelling. It's by Thomas Cole. He painted it for a New York architect over a period of 5 weeks. And he incorporated architecture from the Egyptians, from the Greeks, from the Romans, Gothic style. He finished it, like I said, in 5 weeks, really, really quickly, delivered it at the National Academy of Design to a very famous architect in New York who refused it. Because he said, it's just about architecture. And they went back and forth in a series of public letters. Thomas Cole ended up keeping this painting until he passed. But in the letters is something I find personally, and I hope you do too, really compelling. For architecture to arrive at the perfection which we see in the best examples of Greece, ages of expression and thought must have been necessary for the human mind to have traveled by slow degrees from the rude column of unknown stone, such as formed in the Druidical structures through the stupendous portals of Egyptian art, to unsurpassed beauty of the Grecian temple. Roman architecture is but depraved Greek. The forms are borrowed, but the spirit was lost, and it became more and more rude until it sank to the uncouth incongruities of what are called the Dark Ages. I lived through that in tech. As an example for you, the watcher, which is Hadoop? Where does SQL Server fit? What is Teradata? I like to ask myself that question as I read this. And he goes on, I'll share the slides, you'll be able to read it in its entirety. But this is the point that matters. All is lofty, aspiring, and mysterious. Its towers and pinnacles climb towards the clouds like airy fabrics, ever hovering on the verge of the impossible. On it, the mind does not dwell with satisfied delight, but takes wings and soars into an imaginary world. The longings, the imaginings, the lofty aspirations have found expression in stone, ever hovering on the verge of the impossible. This is our opportunity. This is our data engineering challenge. Where are we able to take our ideas and the medium, the form, the tools with which we build our architecture to soar into an imaginary world? What is real time? Now, you may think that you just heard what I shouted. And you did. But practically, you heard it before you heard it. The physical reality of the creation of sound means that the vocal cords that I am using, which translates into the microphone that is on my chest, which runs through the speakers, again, with the latency of wireless, means that now differs based on who you are. One of the worst things, and I spend an immense amount of time at conferences, is the discussion of real time. Because I say, what does it mean to you? And everyone has a fundamentally different understanding of real time, and that understanding needs to be driven by the experience of the consumer, not the owner of the tooling. I spoke with a financial services company, and I started talking to them about real-time and real-time analytics, and ClickHouse user does real-time fraud analysis in card transactions, and they're like, yes, real-time is immensely important for us. If we can have a latency of less than 1 week, it would be ideal. And I was like, you're right, that would be ideal, and I have a target that our team is going to love to help you support. My now is not Paul's now, is not Lee's now, is not Cheryl's now, our nows differ. Does anyone actually know what this picture is? Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, perhaps one of the most important humans in computer science. She used to do an exercise in her classes where she would hand out small pieces of wire. 11.8 inches long. That's the maximum distance that electricity can travel in a nanosecond. Our notion of now, our conceptions of real time are governed by physical reality. Is this real time? I stood outside as it was pouring rain. It felt like home. It was 16 degrees, cloudy, pouring down rain, and I was like, I'm in the Netherlands again. And I took a photo. And because I took a photo on my iPhone, the highlights are blown out, like quite severely. The iPhone's really good at blowing out highlights. Is that now? Because what I see is 8 minutes of latency from when the sunlight first left the giant burning ball of gas that warms the planet we live on until it reached the lens of my camera. We were asked a very important question in 1984. How soon is now? The answer? There is no now. There's an understanding of user experience. This can be both horrifying and incredibly empowering. My encouragement is let it be empowering. So then what is scalability? I am going to give you the most technologist answer ever. What is scalability? It depends. It's such a great tool, right? It depends. It's such a great way to answer a question, as long as you follow up with more information. How are you going to solve our data science problem inside of the company? It depends. If you stop there, you've not answered the question. But if you begin with it depends, you've opened the universe of possibility for them. There's planet scale. There's internet scale, there's regional scale. There's actually folk right now who are doing research on quantum scale, where they're trying to understand entanglements and how that can relate to data delivery at the edge, which is brain-breaking in perhaps the most beautiful way. This is a meme, but it's also an actual quote from a blog post that was subsequently deleted, where they talked about scalability, a database company who will not be named, and they said, our scalability plan is 100% uptime, as much as possible. As much as possible. We think about scalability, and I think many modern vendors think about scalability as sort of a shared everything architecture. Separated storage and compute, the opportunity to separate compute from compute into node groups so that you have the opportunity to build interesting user experiences, keeping their understanding of now in mind, using object storage as a storage layer, choosing the format that you want to store it in, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really compelling area to understand, but it's also not the point. What is this talk? So maybe this is a talk about strategy. I promised in my abstract a framework, and then Lee got on stage and spoke, and I was like, well, I don't need to develop a framework anymore because he has delivered it to all of us. So if you didn't see that talk, go watch it. So instead of giving a framework, I'm going to give you one final story. Strategy, as taught through children's toys from the 1950s. In 2008, Rolf Skyberg, who's an amazing, amazing technologist who worked at eBay, he called himself a pattern hound, released the concept of what he called toy duck syndrome. Toy duck syndrome is when a company or a data engineer bases their strategy on what is currently most pressing, the problem of the day. Toy duck syndrome is what I feel, what you feel, what your users feel, as if they were riding a toy duck pulled by a very short string that's wobbling back and forth and falling over. It's an inherently unstable toy. And that can be from external pressure, it can be from internal pressure, it can be from strategic decisions. The solution to a toy duck syndrome is simple. Lengthen the string. Look further into the distance than you are today. If my horizon point is a constant goal that I am striving for, the length of string makes the duck. My technology decisions, my user experience, the teammates who work with me, my management, it makes their experience stable. There are two types of leaders. There are leaders who stomp off into the distance and say, we are here, come join us. And then there are leaders who stand alongside others and say, that's where we're going, let's go there together. Some of the most effective data engineers, in my opinion, which I'm always happy to give, are the latter. That's where we're going. Let's go there together. So what's the point of this talk? Don't let today fade. I almost guarantee you've learned something. And if you haven't, you might not have been listening effectively. If I could be that bold, don't let today fade. Interactions like these are always compelling because we stand in the hallway and we ask questions. We ask questions of vendors. We ask questions of each other. Tonight, as we finally pour beer in our face hole, we will ask questions about how the experience was. Continue that. And then build fearlessly. Importantly, use the right tool for the job. The corollary to this being, if you're not doing the right job, you're a tool. We are ever hovering on the verge of the impossible. On it, the mind does not dwell with satisfied delight, but takes wing and soars into an imaginary world. We are building on the work of others, but we have the opportunity to innovate on them as well. Perth Town Hall. This is my first time in Perth, so I wandered around a bit, largely trying to find clothing. But I wandered around a bit. I found out that Perth Town Hall is actually the single best example of Gothic architecture influenced by Western Australia design. It sits there, standing its ground, owning its place amongst skyscrapers with the names of multinationals on them. And Perth Town Hall stands. It's on the corner of Hay and Berwick, I believe. It was designed by Donald Bailey. It is Australia's only Gothic-style town hall. There's a bunch of things that make it incredibly unique, but it's also the only town hall built by convicts. It was, at the time, the tallest building in Perth. My encouragement to you, build that. It's uniquely beautiful. It's uniquely powerful. It met the need of the user at the time, and it will last the test of time. But importantly, for those of you in this room, it's uniquely Perth. Build the experiences that are regionally specific that users demand, and do so fearlessly. Thank you so much. I really greatly appreciate it.